My name is Dr. Rick Saguil.
And action. Hey, Jay had a... This is Kirk again. And action. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Rick with Herbal 411, and today's video is a dovetail to my first two, part 1 and part 2 of carb loading. It should be carb backloading, but this one is for Ben because Ben is a very competitive race walker, and I wanted to help him maximize on his potential, which I will get to at the bottom of the video. But if this is the first time you're finding me, don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you like what I put out, and the notification button to find out when I do new videos. I usually do a couple a week, and as I'm transitioning into a different form of practice, I will probably do one every day. So if you are a burned out athlete or a middle-aged burned out anything, check out my videos, My Quantum Shift, because you'll see what I'm going through. Maybe you'd benefit from the same thing too. Also, if you like the video, hit a thumbs up because it helps the website perform better. So the idea is with this number 3 version of carb loading for Ben. So assuming that you have practiced and found your own types of nutrition, keto, paleo, fasting, intermittent fasting, fasting mimicking diet, everything I mentioned from last time, even veganism or semi-vegetarianism, whatever you're practicing, it's important if you're an athlete, especially if you exercise, even if you're not an athlete. I call myself an athlete. I'm 57 and I hold 2 bodybuilding titles. That was like 40 years ago. Nope. Yeah, 40 years ago or something like that. But it still resonates with me, and I still go for those poses in the mirror when I'm by myself, just to make sure that I'm doing things properly. That's my excuse. So the objective, though, is even if you're not a competitive athlete, it's important to try to maximize on your potential. And it makes a difference. When you're in your 20s, this is by the work of Walter Longo. When you're in your 20s, probably doesn't matter. As I mentioned in my videos before, you can eat crappy food. You can eat tar, which has a glycemic index, and you can still use that as fuel. Now, as you get older, because your metabolism is so spot on, as you get older, things go into preserve the body and the metabolism, and it's almost like as you get older, everybody has a thrifty gene. That means that you're going to hold on to excessive amounts of fat or fuel and turn it into fat in your tummy and in your saggy hips, more so than when you're in your 20s, and the same exercise you used to rely on back then, the same diet you used to rely on back then, definitely it doesn't serve you as you get into your middle age or later ages. So I love to see my patients age and embrace athleticism because I think it keeps you out of disease. You know, it'd be great if we could all die overnight, no suffering, and really contribute to our community, our culture, our families. But nowadays we don't. In fact, the burden is being put on the kids because we're going into our 50s, 60s, and 70s with massive amounts of little diseases, and all those diseases come up and become or make you dependent on your kids and your grandkids to take care of your butt and wipe your butt and push you around and care for you, and it's just too damn expensive to put anybody into a nursing home nowadays. So you are becoming a parasite. So I hate to say it that way, but I'm trying as best as I can to not be a burden to my community and my kids, but it is tough. Anyway, I'm getting off track. So we're going to go into the weeds here. So Ben, assuming that Ben is eating healthy, I am going to go through this in short order. So the idea is if you watch my first 2 videos, there's some glycogen that exists. Glycogen is like the luggage of glucose. Glucose is the fuel source that gives you a lot of energy, and glycogen is the luggage that carries all the glucose. Now, in the body, at one point in time, depending on your size, you can have about 600 grams of glycogen around. The liver will hold about 160 grams, and muscle altogether, again, depending on how big you are, how muscular you are, can hold like 300 to 700 grams of glycogen at a time. The brain also has a little bit of glycogen, so it will have it just in case. And there's always also going to be glycogen in the bloodstream just to feed the brain in case you dive down into starvation. And again, even if you starve, there's always going to be backups just in case. Fat is supposed to be the backup for running out of your fuel source. And then protein is the last backup when you run out of everything. But I mean, most Americans are overweight. Most Americans aren't emaciated like there's kids in underdeveloped countries, Indonesia, that we used to see pictures of, just starving it's called kwashiorkor. Now, they don't have enough protein, so their bellies get really big, but they're just bone skeleton, and they have flies in their whole bowls. I think you used to see those kids on the UNICEF box. UNICEF used to donate coins in school. I don't know if they still have that now. But that's the typical picture of somebody that's starving, but yet still is starting to digest their own body. The protein has fuel source. Anyway, so the idea is that if you are an endurance person, I would highly suggest you do something of cross-training to build up resistance. Or to add resistance to your training. I think it makes for a well-rounded individual. It also helps you stick more grams of glucose and glycogen in the liver, and also build up more grams of glucose and glycogen in the muscle. Now, if you can do that efficiently, then you will, even if you're an endurance person, you will be able to call on that glycogen sooner or later. Most endurance people, especially the Kenyans, when they do the marathon, man, I used to always volunteer at the Chicago Marathon, and for some reason I'd be put at like the 13-mile mark. The tent there was good. We had a band all the time, but it was kind of, nobody would really turn in their chips, so it was kind of boring, and you'd have to wait. But when the Kenyans came by, they just zoomed by, effortless, no sweat, not even breathing hard, and they just, you wouldn't even hear their feet. You just see them go by, and then they're done. Then the elites would go by, and then the big crowd would come by with the costumes and everything, all the overweight runners. And there's nothing against being overweight, but just they're so fun to see those guys. And those are the guys that sometimes take a break. They they just take a break and they sit on the medical cot in the medical tent, get some Gatorade, get some water, and then they take off, probably drunk again. So anyway. The objective, though, is even if you are a distance person, you're going to have to call on the type 2s. The type 1 muscle fibers for distance. It decreases, its endurance is outstanding. Those type 1 fibers will let you go forever. But type 2s are when you need to burst. And when do you need to burst? Even a distance person, a sprinter is always burst. They call on muscle to just expend everything in a short amount of time. Distance guys, they won't need it up until the end. If you've ever watched any of the marathons in New York or Boston, usually there's going to be one or two guys at the end that just battle it out, and you see a sprint occur. And that is when you will exhaust glycogen. That is when, if the guy who is better trained and has more glycogen will actually be able to outrun the other guy, outperform the other guy, hopefully if they're evenly matched, because he has more fuel to sprint and call on type 2 fibers, because they've been calling on type 1s for about 3 to 4 hours already. So that's a hidden gem, and this is how you would load it up. So Ben, being a race walker, he would benefit from this too, but he's putting some muscle into his 10 kilometers, or I should say, the studies show that if you really try to carb load properly after a good training session, you can actually improve your 10K times by 6.6%. And I'll get to that in a second. But so I've already talked about resistance and trying to add a little bit of resistance training to your regime. Now you gotta make sure this is okay with coach. He probably doesn't want you to get too bulky. I doubt that you'll get too bulky, but I think it's helpful. For my non-athletes, not like Ben, but my non-athletes, if you're getting into your 50s, late 50s and 60s, it's important to add some resistance, because that builds muscle, and muscle is what actually prevents you from falling down and breaking a hip. One of the biggest problems with being older is that when you have poor balance, when your muscles are very thin, when your bones are very thin, once you fall, you crack a hip. Usually, at that point in time, statistically speaking, patients don't leave the hospital. Now, it's a little different because we're having hip fractures early, but bottom line is whenever somebody would break a hip because of osteoporosis, that was due to age, and then muscle weakness, that was probably due to conditioning, they would not leave the hospital. So it is important for anybody, athlete or non-athlete, to try to develop some type 2 fibers. And plus, it also helps you beat the insulin response. Check out my first 2 videos as far as how it would help with insulin, because it makes your body more adept at utilizing glucose, and it also makes you conscious about making choices late at night, early in the morning, and exercising. So it just makes you more aware of how to live a healthy life. When you have a goal, if you have no goal, no competitions coming up, no 14,000 foot hikes up Colorado mountains, it's like you just existing. And the goal setting and eating become a different priority, and you just will probably venture into being unhealthy. So I always say get a goal. So if you can develop type 2 fibers, as long as coach says it's okay, then do so. I always tell my patients 15 minutes, 3 days a week, and then 60 minutes on the weekend, that's fine. To be exact, if you participate in high intensity exercise, it should be 30 minutes, 3 days a week, and that's it. So 30 minutes usually will exhaust your glycogen stores in your muscle to the point where the glycogen gets to a critical value, and then the body is triggered to hunt for glucose to restore glycogen. Remember, glycogen is the storage luggage for glucose. Glucose is the energy packet that the cell utilizes for fuel. When your glycogen or your luggage gets empty, there's going to be somewhere along the line, there's going to be a trigger that tells the body, hey, we're running low on fuel. You better start tanking up. And usually most athletes would hit the wall once they get to a certain amount of glycogen per muscle cell. And in the well-gifted athlete, they'd probably switch from glycogen over to fat or free fatty acids for fuel. That's if they're fat adapted or metabolically flexible, which most of my athletes should be. But in this case, we're just going to talk about carbohydrates. So once you do approximate 30 minutes of high intensity, very active activity, 3 days a week, then you probably got to the point where you exhausted your glycogen stores. So now the trick is how much glucose do you take in per hour and per day to fill the tank again, to get the glycogen stores back to where they were, even higher. So there's something called supercompensation, but we'll talk about that in a second. So phase 1 after any form of exercise, and I said it's 15 minutes of high intensity interval training, and if you're not sure what that means, watch my video, 15 minutes of hell. So 15 minutes of just high intensity stuff is what I suggest, but if you want to be exact, 30 minutes. And if you do that and you exhaust all the glycogen, then you have 2 phases where you can get glucose into your cell. The first phase, you don't need insulin, which is really cool. So as the body triggers low glycogen levels, that message gets to the brain, gets to the muscles, and the muscles will soak in any glucose or any fuel that you take as glucose. So it's important during in some studies they'll just say 30 to 40 minutes is the only window you have. But I think you have a little bit more time than that. To be strict, it's 30, 40 minutes, and during that 30 to 40 minutes, you try to get in 20 to 30 millimolar per gram. I think it's supposed to be kilogram, if I'm not mistaken, body weight per hour. So this gram should be kilograms. I have to double check that. I'll put it in the post notes below. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is that's when you get glucose into the cell and you start filling up on your tank really fast. The phase 2 is slower, so that's when the GLUT4, there's a little receptor called GLUT4, and see my other video on carb. When the body exercises and the muscle cells start to waste all their glycogen, there's something of a receptor called GLUT4 that makes its way from the cell, inside the cell, to the periphery, the cell membrane. And when it touches the cell membrane, it acts like an anemone and pulls in glucose from the bloodstream into the cell. And then, but that usually goes away after a while. And then you go into phase 2, because when those little foot processes, the receptors are on the cell, it'll pull anything in really fast. So as long as you take in that source, it'll pull it out of the bloodstream and into the cell to start building the luggage up. Now, after you pass phase 1, you'll hit phase 2 when the GLUT4 receptors, they go back into the cell, and you just have the normal process of insulin being secreted with your glucose to be pulled into the cell for the usual rebuilding of glycogen stores. Now, the phase 2 is supposedly about 4 hours. And I think you can extend it past the 4-hour mark, but a lot of my athletes can't eat that long or have difficulty with eating that much. So it is important because you can actually get into, as best as you can, to feed with the measurements, and it would be 2 to 3 millimolar per gram of body weight per hour. I think this is a little off. I'm sorry. This could be the rate. In fact, I think that's the rate that the body absorbs glucose, 20 to 30 millimolar per gram per hour. And then in the slow phase, or phase 2, 2 to 3 millimolar per gram per hour. So obviously, it's a tenth of what the speed of the absorption is. Sorry, that's what it is. It's that. That's a tenth of the speed of absorption, but now you're relying on insulin instead of having the GLUT4 pulling in. You can also, if you take enough carbohydrate in, and I really think you should be doing low glycemic index, but there are some studies where they try to force in high glycemic index loads. But there is something called supercompensation. That's when you forcibly put into your mouth an aggressive amount of carbohydrates. And I'll discuss that at the end. At least I'll give you some four or five examples. But if you try to load up with 8 to 12, or if you try to load with increased carbohydrates, you might get to the point where you get 8 to 12 millimolar per gram per hour. That's called supercompensation if you up the amount of carbs that you're taking. And I'll get down to the bottom as far as how much you should be trying to approximate. So, and the other option is if you can't, because that's a lot of work, if you can't get that much carbohydrate into your mouth within an hour and then another hour and another hour up to 4 hours, that's 4 hours of eating. That's usually a deal breaker because we either have to be in class or you got to be working. Or if you work out at night, you're probably going to sleep, and you don't want to be eating when you go to sleep. So I'll get to that in a second. But in fact, here's a second. So there's an old adage called train high, sleep low. So when you're in training, you go high carbohydrate. When you're sleeping, you go low carbohydrate. Because after you wake up, you don't want to be dumping insulin into the bloodstream to clear the carbohydrates that you previously ate the night before out of the bloodstream. Because insulin in the morning or all day long is not a good way to start your day. Because theoretically, insulin is a catabolic hormone, whereas growth hormone is a anabolic hormone, if that makes sense. So technically, insulin will break down muscle tissue, which is what you don't want, and growth hormone will build up muscle tissue, or testosterone will build up muscle tissue. So I've just kind of simplified that in such a butchered way, but that's the basic premise. Is we're getting into the weeds, but we're still kind of just looking at the overall picture of what you're supposed to be eating as far as carbohydrates are concerned. So train high, sleep low. High training, and that could be training with the high part. You want to be doing the carbohydrates after you exercise, as I mentioned all above here. There are some people who load up before the training, but I don't think you have to do that. In fact, you run the risk of stimulating insulin if you eat carbohydrates before you exercise. Even high amounts of protein before you exercise, you can turn on insulin. Insulin might not work the way you want it to work when you're trying to build muscle. So I would just do it after I eat. And I mean, after I work out. And I work out in the morning. So, and then after my workout, I'm fasted for at least another 6 hours. So that's a little tough for me to introduce carbohydrates or proteins into my into my morning fast. So if I work out at 5 and my first meal is at 12, that's kind of a deal breaker, but I do the best I can. So then I'm going to be mostly in phase 2. So I'll be giving myself, I'll try to supercompensate, but I don't eat that much. I'm low calorie to begin with, but I'll try to supercompensate as best as possible over the ensuing couple of hours of the day. Usually it's going to be, if I worked out at 5, I'll try to compensate from 12 till I have my last bite at 8 p.m. And that's working for me, although I am not in big competition. I'm just trying to do 15 minutes 3 days a week and 60 minutes on the weekend and then not get hurt. So, but for you athletes and you competitive guys, gals, that's what I would do. So you don't change your training regime just to fit this in. If you're morning, stay morning. If you're evening, stay evening. But if you happen to be evening, it kind of goes with backloading carbohydrates. So the concept of backloading was mentioned in my first 2 videos. Backloading just means throwing most of your carbohydrates in at night. And I think that having an insulin response, if you do have an insulin response from carbohydrates, it's better at night. During the day, I would not try to do that because, again, insulin makes you sleepy. If you think about it in its broadest sense, insulin and carbohydrates make you sleepy. You don't want to be sleepy in the morning and the afternoon. That's what usually the post-lunchtime crash comes from, is doing mostly carbohydrates. So if you have that post-dinner crash, it's sleep time, so why not? You'll sleep deeper. So I would say the endurance type 1 fibers would benefit and usually benefit from the use of free fatty acids as their fuel source. But I would always say if you can also, as I mentioned above when I first started, if you can also try to, it works to preserve muscle glycogen, so it's kind of a good thing, but I'd still try to train with low resistance, even if you are an endurance person. So the spoiler here is that if we're going to try to get in high carbohydrates in 24 hours, 24 to 36 hours after an aggressive workout and before your competition, I would shoot for 9.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And when there was a study done with, just like Ben, race walkers, and when the race walkers did 9.8 grams per kilo of body weight per day, they had restored their glycogen stores 92%. That's a spectacular amount it's almost 100%. That's almost to the point of supercompensation, overfilling the muscle to its maximum carriage of glycogen store. So the study that they did over the course of 3 weeks for the 10-kilometer race walkers showed the 6.6% improvements in performance when they followed this amount of daily carbohydrate. But for me, if I was to do, let's just round that off to 10 grams per kilogram, I'm 63 kilos per day. That would mean if I had to do this, 63 kilos by times 10 grams, that's 630 grams of carbohydrate. That's a lot of carbohydrate. I can't do that. And I'm not as gifted as a 10K race walker, but that's where I talk about using protein. Where is that? Here, using protein. So carbohydrates and fats, they block each other. So if you're doing one, then do it fully. If you're doing the other, then do it fully, but don't do both at the same time, because too much fat will mess up the refueling and the reconstitution of glycogen. But if you do carbohydrates and protein, then they're complementary. In fact, the suggestion is 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kilo of body weight of protein. And that can come out to, well, at the least, I would say, to round this off, I hate 0.3 and 0.4. It's so hard. I like 0.5. So if I do 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, remember, I'm 63. So that's approximately, if I round off 63 kilograms to like 60, and I take half of 60, that's like 30 grams of protein. And I do that with my supplementations. 30 grams of protein is easy for me to remember, not 0.3 or 0.4. So I just rounded it off just for the sake of our discussion today. So if I can't do 630 grams of carbohydrate, then I'd crank it down a little bit, but I'd add protein, which is what I always do. So check out my video on protein and timing. So in a scoop of whey, you can have like 30 grams of protein, and then plus the vehicle you're mixing it in with, whether it's milk from a cow or plant-based milk. So for plant-based protein, you probably have 20 to 25 grams per serving, per scoop, in most of the big bottles. So if I just get a scoop of my plant-based protein, I should be good enough, 25 to 30. Now, if I can do that and maybe do the best I can with my carbohydrate post-exercise, I should be okay. Again, if you can increase your fuels, your glycogen storage to almost 92%, that's awesome. And that's with the guys doing aggressive 10Ks over the course of 3 weeks. If there's a 3-week study that showed a better performance improvement by maximizing on carbohydrate, why not do it for what you're doing? If you're race walking, if you're training for a marathon, if you're a sprinter and it's track season now, try to get into the habit of measuring out. I like rounding things off because I don't like that point thing. I like rounding things off. So 10 grams per kilogram body weight per day is what you should be doing. And try to do a lot of it during phase one. The first, let's just say, this says 30 to 40 minutes, right? I just say within the first hour. Again, I like rounding things off. Within the first hour, after exercise, grab as much as you can, 10 grams per kilogram body weight per day, forcing most of it in at that point, and then all the rest just divide up and put it into the body over the course of time. If it's too much for you because you just don't eat that much or you're on a budget, then try to get the protein in there as well. Doing both protein and carbohydrate, that's not bad. I'd probably say if you're older, then you should be doing protein, aggressive amounts of protein, because it helps us with sarcopenia. 50 to 60 to 70 years of age, we have an issue with sarcopenia, meaning wasting away of our muscle sources. That's why when you see somebody that's lost massive amounts of weight, they look very gaunt because they're also losing muscle. And they look really skinny in the neck. So we don't want to do that. So older athlete or older pseudo-athlete, try to get the protein in. Older athlete, younger athlete, shoot for that. 10 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So the other thing to keep in mind is that you, if you're, let me see. Oh, here are the suggestions. So I just wrote down a couple of things here. Baked potato with skins, about 36 grams of carbohydrate. Enriched penny pasta, about 169 grams of carbs. Black bean canned beans, 218 grams, but be careful with the sodium here. Enriched wheat bran in the morning with raisins, 191 grams, and whole wheat bread is about 8 grams. So there's an option there for you to kind of measure what you can take in, and there's a lot more out there if you just get a good calculator. I like MyFitnessPal. If you put your usual intake into MyFitnessPal, it'll give you the breakdown. Going with low glycemic index carbohydrate, I think, is healthier. The studies were done on high glycemic index carbohydrates, meaning the things like this that get evaporated, so to speak, fast and get broken down fast. But there is no change, low versus high, and I think low ensures that you're not going to have an insulin response, or not it ensures, it makes it higher possibility that you won't have an insulin response later on. So I would always stick with low carbohydrate, low glycemic index carbohydrate. And I'll put a video I did on glycemic index. So hopefully that gives you an idea about what you're supposed to be doing. If you have any questions on all this in the weeds calculations, put them down below. I'll probably have to watch this again because I'm going to make sure that it's not too confusing. But again, it's just a framework. So you always have to ask your coach, and then you have to also plan how you respond to this kind of a load. But if you're going to do it for one season and see how your performance improves. And if you throw in too many variables, you're not going to know. Is it because you were really strict with your carb backloading or your carb loading, or was it because you added steroids, anabolic steroids to your routine, or if you added herbs to your routine, or if you added a new coach? So you're not supposed to change too many variables. Now, if you're working your best freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year, that's only 4 years, 4 seasons, and then you want to vie for a possible collegiate scholarship, you don't have much time. So it is important to try to figure out your way, what works for you as far as fuel, what your budget's going to be, and also to, more importantly, to become very accustomed to knowing what low glycemic index is, high glycemic index, what kind of protein sources you have. So this is all just basic exercise for my young athletes coming out. It's also a basic refresher course for my older athletes or my older pseudo-athletes who are just trying to beat their diseases, like myself included. I just got to beat all the crap that's coming, and so far, knock on wood, I think I'm doing a pretty decent job, but it's because of I'm inspired by patients doing so well that I'm trying to grab little nuggets from my patients and then give them to everybody else. So hopefully this is, if you like this, put a thumbs up, don't forget. Otherwise, don't forget to also hit the notification button so you'll see when I do more stuff. If you have your ways of carb loading and or finding protein sources, put them in the comments down below. Otherwise, I'll see you at the next video.